Am I in the right place for the Palatka general meeting?
Yes, Patrick.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Well, there's a lot of reverberation in that.
It is.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Ms. Harvey,
Yes, sir, I could hear you, Chairman.
Ms. Thomas,
Yes, I can hear you.
is there anyone else we're supposed to have on the line that we don't have on the line? Okay. Patrick, can you hear me? Great, thanks. Okay, well then I guess we'll call the meeting of the Board of Trustees of the City of Palatka. I've got the police officer retirement information in front of me. That's not what we want, is it?
Need the general.
Everything I have here is police. You bear with us for 1 second, please, Will. Thanks, Sonny, appreciate it. So I guess we'll call the meeting of the General Employees Retirement Plan Board to get order right now. And the agenda says, following the agenda that Ms. Sunny was kind enough to print for me, I think, says swearing in of new board members by the city clerk. It would be Ms. Tammy McCaskill, Mr. Jonathan Griffith, who's on vacation, and Mr. Alan Bush. So Sunny, do you want to tend to that for us?
Mr. Holmes, we have Mr. Griffith's meeting recorded. With office, and I'll be playing that. You'll give me just a second.
Okay. Now, why does that not surprise me?
Raise your right hand. I, Jonathan Griffith,
I, Jonathan Griffith,
do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support, protect, and defend the Constitution and government of the United States
that I will support, protect, and defend the Constitution and government of the United States
and of the state of Florida
and of the Charter and ordinances of the City of Palatka,
and of the Charter and ordinances of the City of Palatka,
and that I am duly qualified to hold office
and that I am duly qualified to hold office
under the requirements of the Constitution of the state,
under the requirements of the Constitution of the state,
and that I will well and faithfully perform
and that I will well and faithfully perform
the duties
the duties
of general employees pension board member,
of General Employees Pension Board member of the state,
on which I am about to enter.
on which I am about to enter, and that I will well
So help me God. Welcome to the pension board, Jonathan.
Thank you.
The challenges of Zoom. So I assume that we'll allow that to suffice. And Ms. Tammy and Mr. Bush, if you don't mind, maybe it would be helpful to go down there in front of the podium so Sunny can more easily administer the oaths.
Just in case I forget. I'll keep my mask on, yes, sir.
All righty, Commissioner McCaskill, if you would raise your right hand, repeat after me, and then we'll get Mr. Bush next.
Okay.
I, Tammy McCaskill,
I, Tammy McCaskill,
do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support, protect, and defend
that I will support, protect, and defend the Constitution
and government of the United States of America
and government of the United States of America
and of the state of Florida,
and of the state of Florida,
and the charter and ordinances of the city of Palatka,
and the charter and ordinances of the city of Palatka,
and that I am duly qualified to hold office
and that I am duly qualified to hold office
under the Constitution of the state,
under the Constitution of the state,
and that I will well and faithfully
and that I will well and faithfully
perform the duties
perform the duties
of General Employees Pension Board member,
of General Employees Pension Board member,
on which I am about to enter.
on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Yes, ma'am.
All right, Mr. Bush, if you'll repeat after me. I, Alan Bush,
I, Alan Bush,
do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support, protect, and defend
that I will support, protect, and defend
the Constitution and government of the United States
the Constitution and government of the United States
and of the state of Florida,
and of the state of Florida,
and the charter and ordinances of the city of Palatka,
and the charter and ordinances of the city of Palatka,
that I am duly qualified to hold office
that I am duly qualified to hold office
under the requirements of the Constitution of the state,
under the Constitution and requirements of the state,
and that I will well and faithfully
and that I will allow and faithfully
perform the duties
perform the duties
of General Employees Pension Board member,
of General Employees Pension Board members
on which I am about to enter.
on which I am about to enter. So help me God.
Thank you, sir.
Congratulations.
Congratulations to both of you.
Thank you.
You're now officially members of the General Employees Retirement Plan Pension Board. Thank you, Sonny. Okay, so moving on then, if we could have roll call, Miss Sonny, you ready? Or Jill?
Tammy McCaskill,
Here.
Brett Dennis,
Here.
Alan Bush, Don Holmes,
Here?
and Jonathan Griffiths, who's not here.
Right, Jonathan's on vacation, so, okay. Next order would be the approval of minutes. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes from the last meeting?
Motion to accept minutes is written.
Have a motion, second?
I'll second that.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion that anyone wants to engage in about the minutes? If not, then I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right. Next item would be going to Foster and Foster evaluation report for fiscal year 2020. You're muted, Patrick. So there you go.
You share my screen or do you want to do it on your screen there?
Patrick, I can do it if you want. I have it up.
Easier for me to move around if I just do it myself.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see my screen then?
Yes.
Okay, so, every year as of October 1st, we look at the assets in the plan, the money that's in the plan, and then we project out all the future retirement benefits based on all of our assumptions that we have. And we use that to determine an appropriate funding requirement for the next year. We always do it 1 year ahead. So that right-hand column is the 10-119 valuation that applies to the current fiscal year. And the left-hand column is the 10-1-2020 that applies to next fiscal year. So you can see the cost stayed relatively stable. The total required contribution went from 41.0% of payroll to 41.6% of payroll. The members contribute 6%. And so the city goes from 35% of payroll to 35.6% of payroll for next year. And as always, there's issues that make it go up and issues that make it go down. So we'll try to hit those when we talk about the valuation report. But the most important issue is usually the investments. So I'm going to go down to page 28. And so towards the middle of the page, it says 9/30/2020, 7.73%. So that was your actual 1 year return in the market, on your investments from 10/1/19 through 9/30/2020, 7.73%. But we use this 4-year smoothing technique because we don't want the city's costs to go up and down each year. We want them to be as stable as possible. So to determine an actuarial value of assets, which the only purpose of that is this actuarial valuation report, we take last year's actuarial value and we roll it forward as if they had gotten the 4-year rolling average return, in this case, 6.65%. So that gave us a small actuarial loss here because we were expecting 7.6 and our 4-year average was 6.65. But one of the changes I made in this report is that we're going to start over with the smoothing technique. And we're going to start to use a 5-year smoothing technique instead of a 4-year. And then rather than using the average returns, we're going to take the gain or loss each year and spread it out as a dollar amount over the next 5 years. So if in 2021 we get a loss of 100,000, we'll recognize 100,000 in 2021, 100,000 in 2022, and so on. And mathematically, that's a little better than the smoothing technique we're using right now, because we can start to drift away from the market value with the method we're using now. So I started over and we're just going to say we have the market value as our actuarial value. So that hurt a little bit in this valuation report, but we no longer have to worry about the 4.35 and the 5.61 dragging us down, because I recognized all that immediately. And then we'll just start smoothing whatever comes in 2021. Does everybody understand how we're changing the new smoothing technique?
Patrick, if I could, other than making the paper look better, what does that accomplish?
Well, it accomplishes two things. Number one is that the 5-year average will be, or the 5-year smoothing will be smoother than the 4-year. And the other reason is that if you apply, say, the 6.65% in this case to $19 million for beginning of year, and then let's say we get 6.65% next time as our 4-year average, and we apply it to $22 million, let's say, you can start to drift away. It's not as perfect of a smoothing technique as the one we're proposing to go to. So mathematically, the new one's better, and it has a 5-year smoothing instead of a 4-year smoothing. That's why we're recommending it.
Anybody have a question you want to ask?
Yeah, I guess I have a question. If we missed our goal this year and we keep smoothing this thing, at some point we got to stop smoothing, right?
Well, if you don't want to smooth, then you're happy with me right now, because if you look here at page 8,
Yeah.
so the market value of assets, the real money that Burgess would have shown as of 9/30/2020,
Right.
would be 19,147,000. But with the smoothing, we were pretending like we had 19,977,000. And so we're just going to start over. And so in the left-hand column there, that's the numbers we're using in this report. We're just using the market value, or no smooth at all. But then going forward, we are going to, if we get a loss this year, we'll recognize 20% of it each year for the next 5 years. And all actuaries use smoothing techniques like that, because if we didn't, if you had a big, you guys are heavily invested in equities. So if you had a 0% return one year and you lost, relative to your 7.5%, that might be, $800,000. Well, we don't want the city to have to put in $800,000 immediately.
No, we don't.
Okay.
So
So
we
in
spread
other words,
it out.
and forgive me if my questions are basic or too elementary, but this is not my ball game. Basically, you're telling us that you're using the ultimate rate that you arrive at, in this case, the 6.65, and that is a smoothed rate, so to speak. You're using that in determining the amount of contributions necessary from the city in order to bring us, for lack of a better term, current?
Correct. Yeah, we use this actuarial value there when we determine the funding requirements for next year.
Okay, so that to me explains the importance of what you've just described from my perspective. So I'll hush up right now, but if anybody else has a question, then. Anyone else have questions? Okay.
So then, that's the asset side of the equation. And then I said we project everybody's future benefits and we get a liability. But I just saw this page since we're talking about assets. This is a new page we put in our report this year, page 32. And it's a history of the investment returns and the asset values And we have it here from 2005 to 2020. And so on the bottom of the page, that's your 1 year and your 4-year smoothed returns. So you can see the smoothing works well because the blue boxes are the 1-year returns. So in 2008, we had that negative 13%. And in 2012 or whatever, we had almost 20%. So or 2012. So the smoothing's working good, and only 2 really of those 15 years have you less than 0. And in most of them, you've beaten your assumption. And then the top of the page shows that 10-105, you had about $13 million in the plan, and now you have about $19 million in the plan. So you've had nice improvement in your assets. So turnover is on page 35. And so at the beginning of the year, you had 85 non-drop general employees, and you had 6 people in the drop. And then you had 14 people terminate non-retirement. 1 person passed away, 2 retirements, and 1 drop. And then you hired 21 new employees. So you went from 85 to 88 at the top, and you went from 6 drop down to 4 drop at the bottom. So you went from 91 to 92 overall employees. So relatively stable in that regard. At the bottom of the page, you had 3 retirees pass away. 1 of them had survivor benefits. So all of that experience on the turnover was relatively neutral. This page here is our unfunded actuarial accrued liability, like where we are compared to where we'd like to be. And so we were at $7,299,000 last year, but we make a payment each year to pay that down, the city does. And so we expected it to go to $6,742,000 by 10/2020, and in the end it was $7,854,000.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 16.
16, 16.
Yes. 16.
Thank you.
I went to that page because that shows the impact of everything on your unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And so the investment return using that 4-year smoothing, we had an actuarial loss. Remember, we got like 6.5 compared to 7.6. And then the salary increases were a little bit of a loss, meaning that salary increases were a little bit higher than expected. And then that produces higher liabilities. Those benefits at retirement go up. And then active decrements is your turnover. That was a little bit of a loss. If more people would have terminated, then that would have been a gain. And then inactive mortality, that was an actuarial loss. So relative to our assumptions, all the experience, nothing really helped this year. So we had a net actuarial loss there of $419,000. And then fresh starting the assets caused a loss. There's assumption and method changes there. There was 3 changes. The first was on the assets, the smoothing. The second change is that we switched the mortality assumption to match FRS. Remember, several years ago, the state said all local plans have to use the same mortality assumption as the Florida retirement system. And they changed it about 1.5 years ago. So we had to change it in this report. But that actually helped reduce your liabilities a little bit. And the other nice thing about that is that they're using a public employees mortality table now. A big study was done of public employees across the country to develop a mortality table. And that's what they're using now. So that should be a more appropriate table going forward. And then the last thing we did is we reduced your investment return assumption from 7.6 to 7.5. That's what we're expecting to get on our investments. So if you lower that assumption, that means you're further behind. So that increases your liabilities. And we've done it gradually over the last 5 years, going from 8% down to 7.5%. And I mentioned FRS a minute ago, and they're actually at 7.0%. So, you know, most boards are trying to gradually, like you have been, lower that assumption over time.
Patrick Burgess here. Patrick,
Yeah,
just to help the trustees understand where they are in relation to everybody else. You're encouraging all of your clients to move towards 7%, right?
correct. Yeah, and we look at every summer. We didn't do it last summer because we didn't have an intern because of COVID. But the year before, when we looked at it, the average of all of our plans in the state of Florida was almost exactly 7.5. So 7.5 is where you're at right now. That's not out of line by any means. But, you know, because FRS keeps dropping theirs and interest rates are low, a lot of boards are trying to continue to gradually lower that assumption. Does that answer your question, Burgess?
Well, almost. And I've spent some time with Ash Williams to get a sense of how he's investing the FRS money, and their strategy and portfolio looks nothing like what we're doing here. They do a lot of private stuff. Very different than what we do.
I see.
They'll own lots of land, and they'll buy office buildings and buy warehouses and things like that. They're very different. But
I see.
if the board decided to hold at 7.5 for a couple of years, and the 10-year and 5-year, let's say, performance is well above 7.5%, does the state have any grounds can they compel the city to go to 7%?
Well, they could, but I doubt they would. I mean, there's plans that are still at 8%, and they would probably get a letter. So what happens is that when you guys approve this valuation report today, excuse me, then I send that up to the state. And about every 3 years, they review your reports to determine if everything looks reasonable and the assumptions look reasonable. And so that's when they would review it. And the reports I've been getting lately from the state, they have not made anybody change unless they had more like 8%. They might say, you know, it looks like you should lower it, but they haven't mandated it. So 7.5 is still pretty much the average right now. So I don't think the state would come back and say you had to change it at this point.
Thank you.
So this is, I'm back on page 11. So really there's 3 pieces to the funding requirements, and the first piece is the normal cost, and that's just the cost of each member accruing 1 more year of benefits. And then there's the administrative expenses, and then there's the payment of that unfunded actuarial accrued liability. So that would have went from 20, in the right-hand column is last year's valuation. The middle column is what this year's valuation would look like if we didn't make any changes. And the left-hand column is with those 3 changes that I talked about. So you can see the total required would have went from 41.0 to 40.0. But then with all 3 of those changes, it went to 41.6% of payroll. So those are really the highlights that I wanted to go over, but I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has.
So this is sort of does anyone else want to ask a question first? If not, I have one I want to ask. This is sort of a basic layman's question. If you were to give a grade to the health of our pension plan, the general employees pension plan, from A to F, what would you give it?
Well, I'm looking at page 9. And so your traditional funded ratio, that's where you look at the actuarial value of assets, which we just fresh started. Compared to the actuarial accrued liability is 70.9%. And most plans try to be in the 80 to 100% range. So you guys are a little bit under the 80% right now. So if I just looked at the overall health, I would say a C, but that's totally irrelevant, because if we go back to this page here, you know, we have our normal costs and our administrative expenses, and then we have a payment required to amortize the unfunded. So that unfunded is that $7.8 million. That's how we get that 70.9% funded ratio. And we're amortizing that. We set up little mortgage payments on page 14 and 15. But if you add up all the mortgage payments right now, on that 7.8 million, we're going to make a payment next year of 1,003,000. And so the city, by making this payment, which is 28% of payroll for next year, they're paying that down. And so the plan is always actuarially sound, because every year we look at the assets and the liabilities and we determine an appropriate funding for the next year. And the city always puts in that funding requirement. So it's not a problem that you're at 70.8% funded. And that's probably, you know, if we looked at all of our plans, it would be, you know, probably 60% of our plans are better than that. But you're not that far off of the normal plan.
If you look at the 3 plans here, police, fire, and your plan, the returns are very close. So obviously, and their funding ratios are closer to 80, 82. So there are other things going on that are affecting the funding ratio. And you want to address other factors that weigh in on that?
I know on the police side, they
Turnover,
have had a lot of turnover. But
that's what's
so
pushing
if-
their funding ratio up. You don't have it.
Exactly. So what happens is, I mean, obviously, if you
I have lately.
make contributions to the plan and you get investment returns, and then people just leave and take a refund of their own contributions, well, your plan's going to be in great shape. I mean, ideally, if everybody terminated before retirement, you wouldn't have to put it
Wouldn't have anybody working.
To follow up on what Don was asking earlier, when he was asking y'all to grade our plan, do you, I didn't see it in here, it may be in here and I just missed it. Do you have a comparison with other plans and showing what they've done over the same period of time?
Well,
You mean performance? Yeah.
we do a comparison. We haven't done it for a little while. But the comparison would show the funded ratio and the city funding requirements. Here, I can pull up the last one. Hold on a minute.
I think we get fixated on the performance, which is certainly a big part of it, but turnover is an enormously powerful factor as well.
Well, from my standpoint, all I was trying to do was determine from a relative standpoint what our health was. And then I guess my next question was going to be, other than throwing more money in it from the city's perspective, which we may not be able to afford to do anyway, are there any other things that we can do to improve the funding ratio? other than get you guys to do a better job of investing our money.
Well, you can dial up the equity exposure and push the expected return up. You can do that.
I was joking. on that
No,
one.
it's the police, just by comparison, the police and fire plans have a higher target allocation to equities than you do. And you're still very similar to them in performance.
Are we,
You
by
can,
dialing up the equities, are we increasing the risk?
yeah, and the thing to remember is it's not a linear relationship. So if you take the equity allocation, let's say up to 5%, let's say, you're not going to get a 5% increase in return. You may get a 1% return. And it's non-linear,
Gotcha.
you know, so we can do it.
Well,
So-
no, it wasn't my intent to make a suggestion. I was just trying to ask a question. I mean,
It can be done.
personally, from my perspective, and I'm just one, but
Now,
I think part of
Patrick,
our obligation is to make sure we don't get our risk up to a point.
now
where
here's
it
something important. By
threatens the
going,
plan.
by going to a 5-year smoothing, we had a 4, by going to a 5, if you do dial in more risk, if you have a down period, the impact of that will be lessened because he's stretching out the period. So you're only gonna recognize 20% of that decline instead of, let's say, 25%.
Well, so we depend on you folks for recommendations, or at least I do. Maybe, other people may be more astute in, following this sort of thing, but do you have a recommendation, or am I jumping out of order to ask that question about our allocation of our investments?
He won't tell you the allocation. You won't.
He
You're
won't.
asking him or me?
I'm just asking whoever's got the answer. I don't know. Who has the
Um,
answer? Patrick?
I know that my boss went to a conference once and he said, FPPTA or whatever. And he said he thinks boards should be 100% in equities.
Well, that's not going to work anywhere.
Right. There's lots of issues with that. But if you're just looking at it from a long-term expected return, you're going to get the most out of that. And we do things in the valuation to mitigate the volatility by using that 5-year smoothing.
That's right.
And then if we do have a loss, we're amortizing that loss over a 10-year period, the mortgage payment. So we do the best we can to spread it out, but you're not going to want to be 100% in equities. But I guess my point is that as a firm, we would probably say, within a reasonable amount, the higher you make that equity, the better off you're going to be in the long run.
I've got an illustration I'll show you about that.
So you said that he wouldn't tell me what our allocation is. Why won't he tell me?
That's not his job.
Whose job is it?
Sure,
Thank you.
I'm not a,
Right?
So he didn't want
Investment
to
consultant.
step on me.
and I don't get paid like the board members do, so.
You want to start exchanging comments? Now we can do that.
I'm just joking,
But what I think that the takeaway here, it's a good question when you're grading, trying to grade yourself. But given the fact that the 3 plans here have, and I'll show you in a minute, very similar results, yet the funding ratio here is closer to 70, while theirs is closer to 80, 81. There are other things going on.
Well, I got that point.
So,
But, as I said, you're also dealing with a smaller population in participating in their plans. So the turnover impact of 2 people leaving is a lot different than it is for the city. So I get that.
yeah,
But my question was still the same, and that was, assuming we can't control turnover, we try to avoid turnover because it may positively impact your plan numbers, but it negatively impacts our costs of retraining and continuity and everything else. So assuming we are trying to avoid turnover, are there other things we can do other than killing people off to increase the, the viability of our plan. That's
There-
that's
there
all
are
it's
a
asking.
couple of things
I have a comment on that.
Okay.
So I'm looking here at pages 14 and 15. And so that's the history of different issues with the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. But, each year we look at the overall based on our experience, if we had a gain or a loss. And that includes the investments and the turnover, right? And so in 2020, remember, we had an actuarial loss of 419,000. In 2019, we had a loss of 217,000. In 2018, we had a loss of 709. In 2017, we had a loss of 235. In 2016, we had a loss of 622. So that means the last 5 years, each of the last 5 years, we haven't met our assumptions. So Burgess pointed out the investment return has been fine during that time. So it's really been the other experience, the other issue.
What about salary growth?
And so, we make a lot of assumptions. And we did an experience study in 2016. And we said, well, let's look at all of our experience and let's tweak our assumptions. And we did that. And so the assumptions that we're using right now are on page 20 for the most part. And so salary increases, Burgess just mentioned that, we're assuming 8% for the first year and then 5% every year after that, just because of the way it seems to work with data and such. But we could look at that. I guess my point is that every 5 years you're supposed to do an experience study anyway. So I think we should definitely do an experience study this summer and look at our assumptions, because maybe they're not lining up with the real experience with turnover, salary increases, when people are retiring, even investment return. We can look at that too. So, you want to have the most appropriate assumptions. If you're assuming 9% investments and you always get 7, well, then the city puts in a smaller amount every year, but then you get losses and then your costs go up and your funded ratio goes down. So you want to have appropriate assumptions, and the experience study would help to do that.
Patrick, had the salary increase percentages last couple of years been less than what you assumed?
Well, here's the history, a little bit of a history on page 12.
Still look what page.
Individual salary
Yeah, 1,
increases
2.
have actually been
1,
higher.
2. 1, 2, 12.
1, 2, yep. So individual salary increases, remember, were higher this year than expected. They were 9.93. We expected 5.23. And
So what does that do? So help them understand that the chairman even admitted he's new at this. But slow down on that a little bit and explain why that creates we'll say, a cost.
yeah, I mean, the whole purpose of funding the plan is so we can pay everybody's retirement benefits when they retire. And their benefits here are based upon a final average salary. So your benefit when you retire is 2.5% times your credited service times your average final compensation. And the average final compensation is the average of the highest 3 consecutive years out of the last 5 years. So when someone retires, we look at their last 5 years' pay and we take the best 3 and average that. And that's how they get their benefit. And so if salary increases are higher than we expected, well, then now their benefits are going to be higher than we expected last year, right?
That pushes down the.
So there's a loss there. We have a bigger liability than we expected, and we have to fund for that now. So in each of the last 5 years, the average salary increases have exceeded the assumption. So we've had actuarial losses, increases in liabilities there, from salary increases each of the last 5 years. And then investment return, the actuarial value there uses that 4-year smoothing. And they actually were on average less than the assumption. So they were 6.65 this year was the 4-year average. Last year, the 4-year average was 7.10. The previous year, 5.35. So that didn't help your unfunded actuarial accrued liability. So
So is there any downside to us
Options.
doing the experience study this summer,
what'd you say?
$7,500.
sir?
It's $7,500.
$7,500.
You ought to do it. When was the last time they did one, Patrick?
It was,
It's probably going to help you actually.
almost there. September 20th, 2016. So if I do it this summer, it'll have been exactly 5 years. And I know it's been 5 years too, because when you did the experience study, you decided to reduce your 8% investment return assumption down to 7.5 over 5 years. And this was the last, we just finished that in this report.
You know, that's another thing that has kind of created a headwind. Each year you have incrementally bumped down the expected return. That has been a headwind on getting the funding ratio up more. It has actually been pushing down the funding ratio. Now, if you leave it
Exactly.
at 7.5, huh?
Exactly. And so back to that UAL page, pages 14 and 15, you know, I showed you that actuarial losses each of the last 5 years. Well, then you can also see the assumption changes. So each year when we reduced that assumption, the interest rate, it bumped up the liabilities about 200 and little over 200,000. So you can see we had an assumption change in 2016. That's when we first had to change the mortality assumption. And then we had the investment return at the same time. 2017, we had the investment return assumption. 2018, we had the investment return assumption. So as Burgess, if we would have kept it at 8, you would have a better funded ratio right now. But you would have had more losses because you'd have to try to beat 8% instead of 7.5.
So board members have any thoughts about authorizing the experience study?
Does it pay for itself? I mean, is it going to be a payback for doing it?
It is.
Yes.
I think so.
Okay.
Mr. Bush, you have any thoughts about authorizing them to do the experience study this summer?
No, not at all. In fact, it'd probably be helpful.
I think it will be helpful as well, you know, over a 5-year period, if it pays for itself and it can't harm us, the only hit, like you said, is the 75. And it's gonna help us, why not?
Well, we did it in 2016, and I don't see that we still have losses years after.
Well, I think if I understand it correctly, and as Burgess so kindly noted, I'm pretty much ignorant on all these things. But as it appears that the experience study drives the assumptions
Right.
that are made, and the assumptions drive the contributions at some point, or the amount the city pays. So I guess,
It'll better prepare you for the future if you have a better sense of the assumptions.
and you know, given the fact that we are 10% under what, I mean, we're only on a C, you know, I guess you guys would probably be willing to drop the cost of that study down a little bit, wouldn't you? I mean, they bring us up. to-
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and this will help you a little bit.
Because it's a firm-wide minimum. So I keep-
Patrick,
I guess that answer was no.
so this will help Patrick because he's quick with numbers. The value of the plan at the end of December was 21.2 million. It was up 11% for the quarter. How much would that improve the funding ratio?
So what'd you say the assets were?
21.2 million as of December 31st. Well, we'll see. You'd be surprised how much you've moved up just in one quarter. Maybe closer to 75.
We can move down that same amount in the next quarter.
Well, actually doing well this quarter too, so far.
Ron, I think you answered your question. No, we're all fairly new in this, having that study done and get that information would probably be a benefit to all of us, I think.
I agree. I think that it's sort of a temperature check I see. And
How many's on it?
a 5-year
About
period.
77%.
How much?
Your funded ratio, if we looked at it on January 1, 2021, would be roughly 77%.
Hey,
But Burgess was
see
pointing
how
out.
quickly it can bounce around? So
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
guess that if someone wants to make a motion that we authorize the 5-year experience, I mean, the experience study, this being the 5-year anniversary of it, if somebody wants to make a motion,
I'll make the motion that we,
any more discussion necessary? Then question's been called. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, so if we could do that this summer, then, as you indicated, Patrick, that would be 5 years from the last one that was done. It would seem to me that that's prudent.
I will do that.
Sir?
I think that you're more like a one of those school sharks or whatever that says they don't know what they're doing, but they really do. So those were good questions and good answers. So those were really the highlights I wanted to go over on the valuation report. Does anybody, if there's no other questions, then the board needs to approve that report also.
Okay, so is there a motion to approve the report?
Motion approved.
Motion and a second. Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, thank you.
All right, I'll stop sharing. There you go.
Anything else you'd like to tell us then, Patrick?
Not at this time, but I'll stick around in case anything comes up.
Patrick, do we also need to send that report to the state about what rate we're going to have?
Yeah. Good point. So every year when you do the valuation report, you have to make another motion, and it's a declaration of the expected return for the next year, the next several years, and the long term thereafter. And I would recommend you just keep that at 7.5%. But you have to do a separate motion for that.
Okay. All right, so you heard the recommendation is the motion that we that we approve an expected rate of return and set that at 7.5%. That was the recommendation.
So moved.
I'll second that.
A motion from Commissioner McCaskill and second by Mr. Daniels. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay. Does that get us where we need to be then?
Yeah,
Okay. All right, then if there's nothing further, thanks very much, Patrick. We appreciate your work and efforts, and we'll move on to Mr. Chambers, who's here
Okay.
with us.
So I'd like to take you to page 21. Jill, would you kindly put that up on the screen, please, for the others who are observing remotely.
Jill, thanks for that too, that reminder. Page 21, you said?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So I'd like it just to zero in on these two charts. One's a 5-year and one's a 3-year, but the risk assets.
Okay, I apologize. I must be looking at the wrong 21. Okay, thank you.
So the strategic model is a combination of risk assets, which are in the northeast quadrant here, and the risk-off assets, namely bonds, which are in the southwest quadrant. So that line that adjoins the little plus sign that moves essentially 45 degrees on the slope, we're on that line, and that dot has been your experience over the last 3 and 5 years. And the triangle, the yellow triangle is the model that we built. And you can see that the experience has essentially been on top of the model. So that the experience has been pretty much what we had anticipated. Okay, you with me?
I
So
think.
back to the chair's question, and is if we wanted to increase the expected return, how would we do that? Well, we'd simply move up that slope, and by moving up that slope, we'd be pushing, adding more equities to the program. So we'd be, and it's, it's not it's pretty easy to do. Right now, we have a 60% target for equities. It's the same as the model there. That's the strategy. And the police and fire plans have a 65%. So they're just a little bit higher than you. But we could push it up even further. We could even go to 68%. Or the policy that we have in place now allows us to go to 70, even though the target's 60. So what we could do is just allow equities to move towards 70. And we'll keep an eye on them, but not trim them back. We trim them back throughout the year to keep things kind of tight to the 60. But if we let it run this year, and I think this is a good year to let equities run because of all the stimulation from last year, and then the additional $2 trillion pop that we just got, equity should continue to go up better than they have in many years in the past. So that's one idea, okay, to consider. The other thing that we could do is dial back some of the costs. And I want to show you, you go to page 15. What we designed for the police and fire plans,
15.
I'm sorry, 15. What we designed for the police and fires, practically all of their money is indexed, practically all of it. We have some indexing here. They pay cap cities a management fee, and in order to reduce the overall impact cost to those two plans, we convince cap cities, why don't you just steer this thing, but use index funds to keep the cost down. Now we have Vanguard, the 500 mid cap, the Vanguard Russell 2000. Those two are index products. There are now lower cost alternatives. We've gotten these assets up high enough now where we can go to Fidelity and get a lower cost solution. Under the convertibles, the Spider Barclays, there's a lower cost solution now in place. And then on the next page, on page 16, the Schwab, actually that one's pretty cheap already. The Vanguard, Ginnie Mae, and the high yield and the short term. Actually, that short term is actively managed. We'll leave that alone. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 index products in place now that we could simply migrate over to the same strategy, but cheaper. If you give us that, we have a lot of clients that say, just do it. When the opportunity strikes, just do it and just tell us you did it. We'll ratify it at the next meeting. So that's another way to save some money. Okay. You can think about a motion on that. So let's just chew on that for a minute. I'd like to take you back to page 19. I've got some data that these endpoints are a little bit different than Patrick's. This is a December, a little more current than his stuff. But if you go back 10 years, the plan has earned 8.5% per year for the last 10 years. And if you take out costs, it's about 8%, 7.9%. These rankings are done on a gross basis, and that's why I'm focusing on this. If you look at I've got the data here for you because I knew you'd ask. The police plan and the fire plan are very close to yours, but they're slightly behind you. You ranked in the top 46th. The police ranked in the 47th, which is 1 percentage point lower, and the fire was in the 48th. You're all very, very close. You're all within a couple tenths of a percent over the 10-year period. If you look at the past 12 months, I'll slide over to the left. Your performance for 1 year bettered both the police and the fire plans. In fact, you ranked, actually, you outperformed the fire plan, which ranked in the top 20th. The police plan ranked in the top 16th. But these numbers are very close, the relationships and the performances. So in my world, if you look at these numbers, the objective for 10 years ago was 8% net of fees. We averaged 7.9. That's pretty close to the bullseye. For the 5 years, you average 9.9. If you take the expenses out, it's about 9, say 9.4. Last 3 years, it's around 9.2. And for the 1 year, the net number is 14.8. So, but now the question is, do you want to let it run more? Do you want to let the equities become a more important part of the outcome? And I think given one, that the smoothing has been pushed out by 1 year, even though you may be concerned about volatility in equity markets, I think we can afford to take that additional risk because we've been given another year to stretch out those outcomes.
So from my perspective, the question is, if we were to say yes, if the board were to say yes, let's let the equities, as you put it, run, do we set a cap at 68, 65 or 70?
Well, if I may, to
Sure.
take some burden off and really risk off of you, you already have an investment policy document you've approved that allows you to go to 70. So I don't think you need to take any action. Let me keep an eye on it. We're talking about it. You can go to 70. You've already allowed it. And what I'm saying you today is, given the sentiment that I'm hearing and a desire to do a little bit better, I'm telling you, we're going to let it run more.
Okay.
And you don't have to take any action. How you comfortable with that?
I'm personally good with that. I don't
All
know
right.
how everybody else feels.
You okay with that? So that means we got to keep an eye on it. We will. And hopefully at the June meeting, we can report back that we had enormous success.
Are you okay with that?
I'm
Alan?
fine with you.
I think by consensus, we're good with that, Mr. Chambers.
Okay?
And then back up to your other issue, which was the cost savings.
Yeah, I think a motion is in order to direct BCA or me to identify other index products that are equal in strategy to the ones already in place that are lower cost, and to make the appropriate changes as soon as possible.
That would be the motion as Mr. Chambers just worded it. Would anybody care to make it? So Commissioner McCaskill made the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Is there any need for further discussion? It sounds prudent to me, and it sounds like that it's in keeping with our fiduciary responsibility. So if there's not any further discussion, call for the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you.
You know, the only other thing, Mr. Chairman, other board members, on page 4 and 5 are some summary of the program and the results. I think we've made a lot of progress today. But notwithstanding the very productive discussions we had with your actuary, I think it is important to note here that these performance figures for the quarter, 1 year, and 3 years are impressive, given the fact that the peer group rankings are very high. That you're being compared against nationally. So I would say these are definitely A to A minus returns relative, because that's what a grading system is. It was a fair question to Patrick about grading the plan. It really is a more complex question. I think we've already touched on some of the issues. So,
And my comment and question wasn't intended to be critical of either you or Patrick or your
no,
firms
fine.
at all. So, taking it from that perspective, it was a question to basically to help me assess from a layman's perspective, some of the things, and you provided answers. So
Well, you have a law degree, so you're much more astute than you want
I
to
know some
admit.
people with law degrees who aren't very astute at all.
But what you've done is you've opened up a conversation, and I think we've taken some action. I think that was the
And we
idea.
appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And again, I think our fiduciary responsibility is always to try to do better, but that isn't intended as a criticism of the job that's been done or the performance that we've seen. So I just want to clarify, my comments were not intended to criticize either of you.
They weren't taken that way. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. So does anybody have any more questions for Mr. Chambers? If not, we appreciate it. And I guess we'll go to Ms. Harvey if she's still with us. I don't see her on the screen anymore.
I'm here. You don't see me?
Yes, we do now. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everybody. The first item on the attorney's report is kind of a follow-up to a question that was asked at the last meeting, which really applies more to the police and fire plan rather than the general employees plan, but it was brought up in this meeting, so we can address it here. There was a question whether or not police and fire members could elect to participate in FRS as opposed to the city's pension plan. And the answer to that is no. The city's plan document says that upon hire, there are full-time employees shall be a member of the plan unless employed in an excluded position. And that is, if I remember correctly, it's verbatim in both the police and the fire plans, just different sections. And then there are a list of excluded positions in the plan document. So the next part of that question is there are times when a city will consolidate, will merge, will transfer, or even terminate the pension plan with another plan. And at that time, another plan that's under FRS. And then at that time, the FRS rules say that the plan members can choose whether to remain in the pension plan, the city's pension plan, or transfer over to FRS. And then if they choose to stay in the city's pension plan, they're able to stay in the plan until they retire. Did that answer the question that was asked at the last meeting?
And we do have a copy of that, so thanks.
I think it did from my standpoint. Does anyone else have follow-up questions? I believe it did. Thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. That was a good question. That, it's good to get them out because otherwise people don't know.
In the hiring process, I've found that that question comes up. People who have time in the FRS are reluctant to come over to us, given the fact that we're not FRS. And so I have run into that lately in a couple of different instances. So that was the relevance of the question.
They may be able to purchase their time, their prior service time, in another agency. Police officers, if you're a police officer in another agency, they may be able to purchase that time so long as they are not receiving or not entitled to receive a benefit for that time in the other plan.
And if they purchase that time, what does that mean?
So I haven't looked at your plan document specifically on the issue, but oftentimes they can purchase up to a certain amount of years, let's say 5 years of prior service, prior police service, prior fire service. And then a lot of the times it will apply for all purposes except for vesting and normal retirement eligibility. But once they are vested, if they bought, let's say 5 years of time,
I got
then
you. I understand. I appreciate that. I thought you meant purchase their FRS time, but you're talking about purchasing time in the city's retirement plan.
well, no, if they purchased, so let's say you have somebody that's over, well, because I live in Broward County, so Broward County Sheriff's Office, and they only did a certain amount of years there, and they're not eligible for a benefit under FRS. They can purchase time worked there, which will then be included in their city's, in your city's credited service. So instead of having, let's say 10 years, now they'll have, if they purchased 5 years, they could have 15 years of service.
Looks like Chair's question. You got-
So all right. So let's back up to your example. Someone's got 10 years in the Broward County Sheriff's Office, and they are FRS.
I believe so.
All right. So let's say they are FRS, and they come to us. They've got 10 years in the Broward County SO. They come to us as a new hire. You're saying that they could purchase 5 years of time in the city's plan?
They would be purchasing their time from, right, they would be purchasing the time that the 5 years that they worked for BSO, and that would be added to their city's time, right? But generally, you have to be vested first within the city before that can happen.
And there'd have to be a contribution amount calculated. So they worked 7 years for the city, which is our vesting time.
Mhm.
And then they'd be able to purchase 5 additional years with the city if a contribution was arrived at.
Correct. They would go to the actuary. He would go ahead and
Okay.
come up with the numbers, right?
I actually think we considered that on one of the plans. Maybe it was the police plan earlier. Okay, I appreciate that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to belabor that.
No, that's all right.
You can also let them know it goes the other way too, I believe. I think they can, if they work for Palatka for 4 years and then they go to FRS, to the sheriff's department, then I think they can do the opposite there and buy that time into FRS.
I don't want them to know that.
Okay.
Just joking.
Understood. Okay. Let's see. So that took care of that. I think the next item is the E-Verify. Yes. And E-Verify was effective January 1 of this year. There is a new law that took effect that says all new hire vendors of the board, so as of January 1st of this year, have to register with and use E-Verify. It's a system that checks the work status of the board's vendors. And I say board, but it's all public entities. So it checks the work status of all public entity vendors to make sure they're legal and able to work in the state. And then it trickles down to all of the vendors, subcontractors as well. The board as a public entity is required to register with E-Verify, and it's a free system. All of your new agreements that our office prepares is required to have a provision in there about E-Verify.
So the city is registered with E-Verify, the city as a whole.
And the pension is too.
And the pension is too, Jill? Thank you.
Wonderful. So that takes care of that. But again, any of your new vendors in the future would have to be registered with E-Verify.
So for instance, if Burgess sailed off to Tahiti and we hired someone new, they'd have to be processed through E-Verify?
Yes, they would have to use the E-Verify system to register with it and make sure all of their hires.
What about people that we already have on board? I'm a little bit suspicious about him. Should we?
Well, it's not, that wasn't with the new law, but we are registered with E-Verify and we've been on board for a while now. Patrick's firm is, and I'm sure Burgess is as well.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Let's see, the last item under the attorney's report, we fill out and review and complete a lot of, let me pull it up, investment manager agreements. And most of these investment manager agreements reference board policy on the agreements. And these, your board did not have a policy in place. So we went ahead and we drafted a proposed policy, which is what you're looking at now. And
Can't see it all. Is it here? Oh, really? Okay.
You got it?
I don't know. I don't know. Let me see if I can find it though. Police officers, Foster and Foster.
Thank you.
How about this? No, that's for the city of police, the police officers. Would it be the same agreement?
it's the same agreement, yes.
Thank you. You can tell that Sunny has me on a need to know basis.
So it's quite lengthy, but really it's meant, obviously to instill this policy, but to give you all an idea of what some of the provisions are that we, as a firm, like to include in any side letters to our investment policy or our investment manager agreements. And a side letter, if you're not familiar, is just, it's a separate agreement that covers issues that are not already included in the primary agreement. For instance, and then I'll go over some of the bigger provisions that we add in there. So one would be an acknowledgement of fiduciary relationship to the plan. That is a must for all of our agreements. A most favored nations provision, and that's just a fancy way to say, hey, if the investment manager engages in an agreement with another plan or client that's similarly situated to your board in size and in funds, then and that board gets a better rate or a better fee agreement, then your board would be eligible for that better fee agreement as well. There is the board. We don't like to have the board indemnify any of our investment managers or their subcontractors. So we put in provisions for no indemnification. We don't like the board to waive any of their rights or defenses. That's another one that we include in there. We like to include that the board's investment policy statement will be incorporated as a supplement to the agreement. Governing law, which is a big one. We obviously seek to have the governing law in Florida. Venue would be in Putnam County. And then we have the required like public records law. There's certain language in all agreements that we have to put in there about the public records law, about the sunshine law, that the board holds open meetings, that the board cannot accept any bids or proposals to hire any vendors that are on the convicted vendor list. And also now the new E-Verify law, that's another one that has to go in there. And we also like to see that the board is given quarterly reports on their investments.
I assume we have a contract with our current investment managers. Do we?
Most of your money is not invested they're invested in funds. But at some point in the future, if you do have separately managed accounts, then these guidelines would apply.
So I guess my question is, if we adopted the policy, and I don't know the board prepared to, but if they adopted it now, would that impact any of our existing relationships?
No, it would be going forward basis only.
And I want to say, we don't have one now. If we can have time to review this for the next June meeting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally understand. It's a pretty lengthy document. Yes, and what's in there, the provisions in there are, they're not easily read on the fly.
Okay, sounds good. We'll do that then. If we can, Jill or Sunny, put this as an agenda item for the next meeting so that we make sure we don't forget it. Then we'll bring it back up then. That's satisfactory with everybody. Okay.
Wonderful. If there's no other questions, then that concludes the attorney's report for today.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next item is expenditures. And who has that information? Right here. Thank you. Don't know, Miss, let's see, I don't know. Doesn't say anything at top of mind. This is police. Oh, you're on the screen? Okay.
October 20th? Yes. Okay.
Is the custodian bank fee on there?
There wasn't one that hit in October,
Do you know,
November, or December.
They're late, you said?
Yes.
Cassandra, I'm sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Sometimes they are late on giving
All
the charge to the pension.
Do you have, Cassandra, do you have a copy of, it's a SunTrust custody agreement, right? Is that
Yeah.
right, Jill?
Yes, it is SunTrust.
Did Cassandra or Jill, do you have a copy of their fee schedule?
Mm.
Or their agreement?
I probably have a copy of their
Okay.
agreement from when they were first hired. I don't
We
really
were-
even know how old that is.
We were able to crack their minimum for another client down in Dade County. So under the most favored nations concept, I think we might be able to get your fee reduced. If you will send that information to me, I'll work on it for you, okay?
Sounds good.
All right.
And that's all good, but I just want to ask the question. You said they were late. Can we kind of ask why, and what can we do moving forward to prevent that from happening?
They decide when they bill out their fees. And if they didn't bill them out in October, they probably did bill them out in October for September of last year. So that went into last year's expenses. So the fact that
They
we
bill them
didn't-
annually.
they bill quarterly. So October, November, December, we probably have it on the January statements, what they billed. But this is just for the quarter of October, November, December.
So it probably will be in the next quarter.
That's right.
That you'll see their,
Mhm.
their
Exactly.
billing.
You can see with Burgess too, he doesn't have his quarterlies in.
Yeah, you
For
don't want to
October.
share,
Terrible.
especially
I'm
with-
I'm embarrassed.
It's just a timing issue.
Gotcha. I like the concept though of him wanting to get people to reduce fees. I do like that a lot. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about the expenditures? Anyone on the board? If not, then I guess we would accept that report. And if there's a motion. Second,
Second.
any further question or discussion?
Question.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That would take us to public comments. Is there anyone? No one's here, obviously. Are we being zoomed, Sunny? YouTube? No public comments. That takes us to other business. Is there any other business to come before the board? Anyone? If not, then I'd like to thank everyone, Patrick, Cassandra, and of course Burgess, for all of your efforts and your participation, and Burgess, you for coming up and attending in person. We appreciate that, even though I certainly am not trying to criticize anyone who didn't come. It's the Zoom thing, I think, for all of us is getting a bit tedious. it's nice to be able to look at somebody when they're talking to us, but if there's not anything further, then I'd ask for a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Everybody in favor?
Aye.
Adjourn. Thanks very much.
It's nice to.
Thank you,
see
everybody.